The Case for Tragic Optimism in Sarah's Key by Kisielewicz. Our learning objectives for today are to understand how tragedy has developed Frankl's tragic case for optimism, understand how we can find meaning in life when we are destined to feel pain, guilt, and death, be able to apply Frankl's case for tragic optimism and find new meaning in ourselves, and lastly, understand the Vel d'Hiv roundup and its lasting effect on the French population within Sarah's Key. Our thesis for today, Frankl's case for tragic optimism illuminates the struggle of finding meaning in life despite suffering. He uses what is referred to as the tragic triad to weigh in on how despite those odds there are those who manage to stay positive even when all seems lost. The tragic triad itself is a mechanism that Frankl uses to describe the process people go through to experience tragedy. There is pain, suffering through life's obstacles, guilt, resentment for a misdeeds or identity/heritage, and death, experiencing the loss of those dear to you. Contrary to the tragic triad, there is tragic optimism. Retaining positivity despite tragedy is a process as well. You can turn suffering into a human achievement by finding meaning, using guilt to change yourself for the better, and derive from life's transistorness an incentive to take responsible action. Re-emerging logotherapy. Within this chapter, you will find Frankl's theory of logotherapy used to give purpose to those experiencing dread or tragedy, and through that, those individuals will find optimism. One example of this is how Frankl cured those he referred to as with unemployment neurosis, in which those individuals would equate becoming jobless to becoming useless. Frankl gave them opportunities to volunteer in public libraries and other organizations, which allowed those individuals to revise their once lost purpose. Evidence by Viktor Frankl, saying yes in life despite of everything, to use the phrase in which the title of a German book of mine is couched, presupposes that life is potentially meaningful under any circumstances. As soon as they fill their abundant free time with some sort of unpaid but meaningful activity, their depression disappeared, although their economic status had not changed and their hunger was the same. And lastly, it may well be that an individual's impulse to take his life would have been overcome had he been aware of some meaning and purpose worth living for. An example of Frankl's optimistic reality. There have been plenty of cases that show Frankl's realization of tragic optimism and how it has been applied to change the outcome of quite a few lives in the face of tragedy. One clear example I can think of is a 15-year-old by the name of Kyle O'Grady was able to overcome the despair of being diagnosed with a brain tumor. He does this by seeking to get the most out of life through focusing on his interests and goals, which allowed him to find meaning and optimism in the face of despair. And a brief discussion of Sarah's Key. Sarah's Key I found to run in contrast to Frankl's theory for tragic optimism. What I mean by this is, in this chapter, Frankl discussed how those experiencing tragedy would regain purpose through logotherapy and through that regain their optimism. Sarah, I will start by saying the movie takes place in France, where Jewish civilians are taken and rounded up by the French police this time, not the Nazis. This event was known as the Vel d'Hiv, and Sarah, our core protagonist, suffered through the Vel d'Hiv roundup, which caused her to blame herself for her brother's suffering. Despite having a family later on, she never truly recovered and found optimism. And our discussion questions for today. Recall a time where you had experienced tragedy or dread. What mechanisms did you use to recover and stay optimistic despite your struggle? And lastly, what optimistic advice might you give someone going through a difficult moment? Please apply Frankl's concept of tragic optimism. And we're excited.